They called her the transfer. That's what Dr. Sterling said when she first appeared at Mercy General in Houston 3 weeks ago, standing in the hallway with her 2 bags and her eyes that didn't quite focus on faces the way normal people's eyes did. They focused on exits instead. On sight lines. On what could happen next. He didn't know that yet. He only knew she was new, quiet, and therefore temporary. Katie Morrison moved through the ER corridors at 6:16 in the morning, before the chaos started, when the fluorescent lights hummed their lonely electric song and the antiseptic smell cut through the cool air like a blade. She organized the trauma supply cart with methodical precision, each instrument placed exactly where it belonged, gauze pads in descending size order, suture kits arranged by needle gauge, the 14-gauge angiocath needle separated from the smaller bore sizes. Her hands moved with a kind of muscle memory that didn't quite fit a 3-week tenure at a Houston hospital. The scar tissue on her forearms caught the light when she reached across the counter for a fresh roll of surgical tape, white lines crossing her wrists like a map of a place she'd promised never to discuss. Another nurse, Sandra, who'd been at Mercy General for 8 years, watched Katie organize supplies for the 4th time that morning. "You fixing that cart again?" Sandra asked, leaning against the counter with her coffee. She said it kindly, the way you'd speak to someone who had a minor compulsion, something nervous and harmless. Katie didn't look up. "It's not organized." Her voice was steady, the kind of steady that comes from practice at keeping everything, emotions, reactions, fear, locked in a compartment behind a thick steel door. Gore should come before instruments. Instruments before medications. "It's fine the way it was," Sandra said, but she didn't argue further. Something in Katie's posture suggested that fine wasn't actually acceptable. That fine would get people killed. At 7:15 a.m., Katie touched the small bulge in her right scrub pocket where she kept a worn photograph of her teenage son, Marcus. 16 years old, standing in front of their house in Houston, wearing a shirt that said Class of 2025 in fading letters. She'd taken the photo 3 days before she walked into Mercy General and became someone else. Someone smaller. Someone who said, "My apologies," when doctors raised their voices and accepted insults the way rocks accept rain, with no visible reaction, just a slow accumulation of weight. The locker room on the basement level of Mercy General smelled like metal and stale breath and the faint copper scent of old blood that never quite washed out of the tile grout. Katie's locker was number 247, 3rd row from the bottom, right side. Inside hung a jacket, faded grey, hospital issue, and underneath it, hanging on a small hook she'd installed herself with a screwdriver from the supply room, was her old leather deployment jacket. The one from before. The one from when she was someone else. The lining had a small tear near the shoulder blade, and sewn carefully into that tear, invisible unless you looked for it, was a faded unit patch. The colors had bled into each other over time, a special forces insignia that meant everything and nothing to everyone at Mercy General. To Katie, it meant the 8 years she'd never existed. The 8 years that the Pentagon had erased. She didn't think about the patch often. She thought about Marcus more. About whether he'd eaten lunch. About whether he remembered that she'd promised to make his favorite, her grandmother's lasagna recipe, the one with the secret ingredient that was actually just time and love, on Friday night. The nurse's station smelled like coffee that had been heating on a burner for too long. Katie arrived at 7:42 a.m. with her chart for the morning shift, ready to absorb her role, ready to fold herself into the background of Mercy General the way she'd learned to fold herself into new identities. Listen more than you speak. Work harder than you're asked. Don't make friends. Don't make enemies. Don't let anyone see you. That's when Dr. Sterling leaned against the counter. He was tall, 6'2", maybe 6'3", with the kind of tailored appearance that meant money and inheritance had been talking to each other for several generations. His tie was silk, dark blue, the kind of blue that only came from Italian looms. His watch was a Rolex Submariner, stainless steel, probably worth more than Katie's monthly rent. He moved with the absolute confidence of a man who'd never been told no by anyone who could enforce it. "New girl," he said, not looking at Katie directly but letting his voice carry across the entire nurse's station so that everyone could hear him. "Dr. James Sterling." Chief of Emergency Medicine at Mercy General for the last 14 years. Connected to the hospital board through his brother-in-law, who sat on it. Connected to 3 other hospitals through consulting contracts that paid 6 figures annually. The kind of connected that made him untouchable. Katie looked up from her chart. 3 weeks and she'd already learned to do this thing with her eyes, make them blank, make them small, make them less. She'd learned it in Kandahar, where the wrong look could get you killed. Here it just made her invisible. $20, Dr. Sterling said, tapping his pen against the counter with a sound like tiny gunshots. He was speaking to the other doctors now, Dr. Hayes, who specialized in trauma, and Dr. Marcus Conrad, who'd been at Mercy General for 6 years and had learned long ago how to laugh at the right moments. $20 says the new girl quits by Friday. These ER transfers never last. They come from bigger hospitals thinking they'll slum it in Houston for a year, get some real experience, then they realize the pay is shit and the hours are longer and they go crying back to their mommy and daddy's air-conditioned offices. Katie's hands didn't stop organizing the chart. Her jaw didn't clench, or if it did, only by a fraction of a millimeter that no one could see. She'd learned that too in Kandahar. The trembling wasn't fear. The trembling was restraint. The absolute, controlled violence of someone who could hurt you very badly and had been trained extensively in 17 different methods to do so, but was choosing, moment by moment, breath by breath, not to. "I'll take that bet," Dr. Hayes said, laughing. "She's lasted 3 weeks already. That's better than the last 3 we hired." Katie finished writing her initials on the chart. KM. Just initials. Just letters. Just a ghost with a nursing license and a fake work history and a son at home who didn't know that his mother's entire life was a classified document that the Pentagon had ordered her to never discuss. What happened next didn't change anything. Not yet. Not in any way that anyone at Mercy General could see. But it was the moment that Dr. Sterling stopped viewing Katie Morrison as just another transient nurse and started viewing her as a problem that needed solving. She turned to the medication cart, the one that held the pain medications, the antibiotics, the 4 fluids that kept people alive, and began checking inventory with the kind of methodical precision that suggested she'd done this exact task thousands of times before. Not thousands of times as a nurse in a civilian hospital. Thousands of times in conditions where one miscounted dose could result in a cascade failure that ended with someone's face down in Afghan dust. Her hands moved through the medications with what looked like efficiency. What it actually was muscle memory from 8 years as a senior chief petty officer in Special Forces, running covert medical operations in a province where the acronym MEDEVOC stood for the difference between going home alive and going home in a flag-folded box. Sandra was still watching her. "You okay?" she asked quietly, so that Dr. Sterling wouldn't hear. Katie didn't look up. "I'm fine." "You seem," Sandra paused, searching for the word. "Focused." "That's the job," Katie said. She checked the 4-bag count one more time, found them in perfect order, and closed the medication cart with a small click that sounded like a safety being released on something dangerous. Dr. Sterling was still talking. He'd moved on to other topics, the new insurance contracts the hospital had signed, the productivity quotas for the quarter, the way that the ER floor was running inefficiently because half the nurses didn't understand proper triage protocols. But every so often, Katie could feel his attention drifting back toward her, the way a predator's attention drifts back toward prey it's marked. By 8:15 a.m., the ER had filled with people. A car accident victim in Bay 3. A diabetic complication in Bay 5. An elderly man with chest pain in Bay 7 who kept insisting he was fine even though his EKG was starting to show the subtle changes that meant his heart was dying cell by cell with every passing minute. Katie moved between the bays with quiet efficiency, taking vitals, running labs, monitoring the chest pain patient with the kind of careful attention that suggested she understood, on some deeper level than most nurses, exactly how close he was to crossing a threshold from which there was no coming back. The morning shift was halfway through when Marcus Chen, a resident physician who rotated through the ER twice a month, entered the station and saw Katie preparing a central line kit for the trauma patient in Bay 3. He watched her hands for exactly 3 seconds. 3 seconds was all it took. The way her fingers positioned the needle. The way she'd already laid out the sterile field in a particular configuration that wasn't standard nursing protocol but was instead the exact setup used by special forces medics operating in field conditions where there was no time to waste and no margin for error. Marcus didn't say anything. Not then. But his eyes lingered on Katie's face for a moment longer than they should have, and in that moment, something shifted. Some recognition that the quiet new nurse who'd been at Mercy General for 3 weeks was not what she appeared to be. Katie felt his eyes on her. She didn't react. The steel door behind which she kept everything remained firmly closed. The cafeteria at Mercy General smelled like institutional chicken and regret. Katie had just cleared a space at one of the corner tables, her salad balanced on her tray alongside a black coffee that was still steaming, when she heard the voice, that particular timbre of condescension that had become as familiar as the beeping monitors in the ER. "Careful, sweetheart." Dr. Sterling's shoulder caught the edge of her tray with the casual precision of someone who had calculated the angle exactly. The tray tilted. Salad scattered across the white tile in an explosion of iceberg lettuce and vinaigrette. Her coffee cup tumbled, the lid popping free, brown liquid spreading across the floor in a perfect expanding circle. 30 pairs of eyes turned toward her. The cafeteria didn't go silent, the silverware kept clinking, conversations continued in low murmurs, but the shift was there. A momentary adjustment in the room's attention, like a spotlight sliding across a stage. Katie knelt down without hesitation. Her scrubs made a soft sound against the tile floor as she moved. Around her, she could feel the weight of people pretending not to watch while watching intently. She had learned long ago that there were different kinds of silence. This one was the silence of anticipation. The silence before something breaks. She was gathering the larger pieces of lettuce when Sterling's shadow fell across her hands. "You'll need this." He dropped a patient chart at her feet. Not handed it to her. Dropped it. The folder landed with a soft thud against the wet tile, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the texture of polished contempt. "That's the Morrison file from this morning. I need it reviewed and refiled by end of shift. And try not to lose this one, sweetheart. I know paperwork's not really your strong suit." A low sound, barely a laugh, came from somewhere near the salad bar. Someone coughed to cover it. Katie took one measured breath. Just one. The kind of breath she had learned to take in a land where breathing itself felt like a decision with consequences. Her hand paused over a piece of lettuce. And then something broke inside her, not visibly, nothing that would show on her face or in her posture, but internally, like pressure equalizing in a chamber that had been sealed too long. A single tear escaped from her left eye. Just one. She wiped it away with the back of her hand, the motion quick and efficient, and when she looked up at Dr. Sterling, her eyes locked directly onto his. When she spoke, her voice was steady as surgical steel. Flat. Controlled. The voice of someone who had held people together while the world fell apart around them. "I've cleaned up worse messes than this, Doctor." The silence that followed was different. This one had weight. This one had teeth. Sterling's smirk faltered for just a fraction of a second, long enough for Katie to see the calculation happening behind his eyes, the recalibration of his assessment of her, before his face hardened again. He turned and walked away without responding, his footsteps marking time against the tile as he moved back toward the surgical wing. The cafeteria returned to normal. Conversations resumed. The moment passed. But something had shifted in the room, and Katie felt it in the way people avoided her eyes as she finished picking up the mess, in the way a nurse from the 3rd floor pretended to need something from the condiment station and took the long route around her table instead of passing directly by. By that afternoon, Sterling had found his opening. The supply closet on the 3rd floor was a narrow space crowded with boxes of gloves, rolls of gauze, and the institutional detritus of modern medicine. Katie was restocking the suture kits when Sterling appeared in the doorway, his frame filling most of the space, blocking out the hallway light. The fluorescent overhead fixture cast his face in sharp relief, angles and shadows that made him look predatory in a way that had nothing to do with his features and everything to do with intention. You know what your problem is, transfer. He didn't wait for an answer. You think you're special. You think this place is different from wherever you came from. It's not. You're not. You're just another nursing school graduate who couldn't hack private practice, and frankly, I don't know why we wasted the hiring process on you. The word transferred hung in the air like a slur. It was meant to. Katie's hands continued their work, placing packets of sutures in their designated slots with methodical precision. Her jaw tightened slightly, just enough that if someone had been watching very carefully, they would have noticed. But her voice remained level when she spoke. I'm still here, aren't I? Sterling's expression darkened. He had been expecting fear or defensiveness or some kind of emotional response he could weaponize further. What he got instead was a quiet statement of fact, delivered with the tone of someone stating something obvious about the weather. He left without another word, but his footsteps in the hallway were aggressive, heel first, hard against the tile, the gait of a man who was angry at being denied the reaction he wanted. The next morning, Katie found out what that anger meant. The surgical team briefing was held in Conference Room B on the second floor, 30 minutes before the first scheduled procedures. 12 surgeons, 10 surgical nurses, 4 anesthesiologists, and 3 residents. The room smelled like old coffee and the industrial cleaner they used on the conference table. Katie stood in the back near the door, which was her habit. It was easier to leave that way, and she had learned long ago that standing in the back of rooms meant people often forgot you were there. Sterling stood at the head of the conference table, his tablet in hand, dressed in the kind of expensive sport coat that signaled professional authority. He waited until everyone had settled, until the room had reached that particular quietness that comes right before a meeting begins, and then he smiled. Before we start with the schedule, I wanted to address something. His eyes moved across the room and landed on Katie like a laser finding its target. Our little transfer here managed to misfile 3 charts yesterday. 3 charts from my surgical wing that somehow ended up in orthopedics. Remind me again why we hire people who can't handle basic paperwork? I mean, it's really the foundation of everything we do here, isn't it? Basic organizational skills? Katie's hands gripped the styrofoam cup of coffee she had brought from the break room. The warmth of it seeped into her palms, and for just a moment, her hands trembled slightly as she fought the urge to crush the cup entirely. But when she spoke, her voice was calm. It was the voice of someone stating a documented fact, nothing more. The voice of someone who had reviewed the charts and knew exactly what she was talking about. Those charts were misfiled before I arrived, Doctor. I corrected them. The timestamps are in the system. Sterling's smile didn't reach his eyes. He had the look of someone who had counted on a narrative that had just been disrupted by facts, and facts were messier to work with than emotions. He turned away from her, back to his tablet, and said something to Dr. Patricia Vance, the medical director, about procedural reviews. But as he moved past Katie toward the door, his voice came again, just loud enough for everyone in the room to hear, just quiet enough that he could deny having directed it at her if confronted. Always an excuse with this one. The room refilled with normal sounds, the scrape of chairs, people reviewing their schedules, the ambient murmur of 30 professionals preparing for their day. But Katie felt the shift in attention again. People weren't quite meeting her eyes. A surgical nurse she had worked with 3 times before gave her a look that was almost apologetic, as if Katie had just failed some unspoken test that had nothing to do with chart management and everything to do with knowing her place. That afternoon, during the Morrison appendectomy, a routine procedure that should have taken 90 minutes, something unexpected happened. The patient, a 63-year-old male named Michael Chen, had been admitted that morning with acute appendicitis. He'd served 20 years as a medic with the 82nd Airborne, and his preoperative chart noted a previous injury to his left shoulder that required careful positioning during surgery. Sterling was the lead surgeon. Katie assisted, standing across from him at the surgical table, her hands moving with the precise rhythm that came from muscle memory, not the muscle memory of nursing school, but the older, deeper kind. The kind that lived in her fingers and in the part of her brain that didn't think anymore, just moved. The appendix came out cleanly. No complications. Just the routine steps of a procedure performed 1,000 times a day in hospitals across America. And then, as Katie began closing, as her hands moved through the layered closure with a speed and economy of motion that made the other surgical nurse beside her look almost clumsy by comparison, she tied the knots with a specific technique. A field suture method. The kind you don't learn in nursing school. The kind you learn when you're working in a FOB surgical tent in Kandahar with limited supplies and a casualty who's bleeding out and there's no time for textbook approaches. From the preoperative fog of sedation, Michael Chen's eyes cleared for just a moment. He watched her hands. He watched the knot work, the tension in the suture, the way her fingers moved with the kind of precision that came from having tied these knots while the ground shook from incoming fire. You learned that downrange, didn't you? The operating room was soundproof, or nearly so. The ventilators hummed their mechanical rhythm. The anesthesia machine beeped softly in its steady pattern. But his voice, barely above a whisper, barely conscious, reached Katie like a frequency only she could hear. Her hands froze for half a second. Just long enough for Sterling to notice. Just long enough for the moment to register as something unusual in the normal flow of surgery. Then Katie's hands resumed their work. She finished the knot, clipped the suture, moved to the next layer. Her voice, when she spoke, was equally quiet. A direct response to someone speaking from the edge of consciousness. I can't talk about it. Please don't ask again. Michael Chen's eyes closed. The sedation pulled him back under. But he nodded slightly, that small motion of someone who understood. Who recognized? Who knew what certain skills meant and where they came from and what it cost to pretend they had never been learned? Sterling finished the procedure without comment. But Katie felt his attention on her in a different way now. The way a predator attention shifts when it realizes its prey might be more dangerous than it initially appeared. After they transferred Chen to recovery, after the instruments had been cleaned and the surgical field prepped for the next case, Katie moved through the hallway toward the locker room. She didn't see Sterling on the phone in his office, but she would have recognized the intensity of his expression if she had. The way his jaw moved. The way his fingers drummed against his desktop while he waited for someone to pick up. In his office, Dr. Sterling opened his desk drawer and pulled out a leather-bound ledger. The pages were filled with handwritten entries, dates, procedure codes, billing amounts, all in columns organized with the precision of someone running a business rather than practicing medicine. Because that's what it was. A business. A very profitable one. One that had generated $47,000 last month alone through the simple method of upcoding surgical procedures, billing for higher complexity cases than were actually performed, routing the difference through shell companies registered to dummy corporations in Delaware and Nevada. He'd been careful. Very careful. For 4 years, he had moved money in patterns that obscured their origin. For 4 years, he had cultivated relationships with board members who benefited from his investment tips, with administrators whose problems he solved quietly, with people who owed him favors substantial enough that they would protect him if questions ever got asked. But now there was Katie Morrison. And she had flagged 17 of his cases in the past week alone. 17 procedures with inconsistent billing codes. 17 documentation anomalies that, if someone with authority decided to investigate, would unravel the entire scheme. Sterling picked up his desk phone. He dialed from memory. Gerald, it's Sterling. Yes, I know you're in a meeting. Take it outside. Listen, I need a favor. There's a nurse in the ER, Katie Morrison, 3 weeks in, who's become a problem. I need her gone. Not fired. Gone. References destroyed, background flagged, the whole thing. Can you call Vance? Tell her you're concerned about this particular employee. Make it sound like a governance issue. He hung up after 40 seconds and dialed again. Patricia, it's Charles. No, nothing medical. Listen, have you vetted that new transfer in the ER? Morrison. 3rd week. I'm hearing some concerning things about her background. Nothing specific, just gaps. Employment history doesn't quite add up. I'd hate for the hospital to have a liability issue. Maybe check with HR, see if she has any documented psychiatric incidents, personnel issues from previous positions. The second call took 60 seconds. The third, to an outside investigator named Robert Hayes, who specialized in employee background verification and had done quietly effective work for Sterling before, clearing out problematic staff members by raising just enough questions about their credentials that they became unhireable, took 90 seconds. Robert, I need a background investigation. Thorough. Katie Morrison, registered nurse, started 3 weeks ago at Mercy General in Houston. Military service background is listed, but the details are vague. I need inconsistencies. Employment gaps. Anything that suggests her background doesn't add up. I'll send the retainer this afternoon. Standard hourly rate. Sterling hung up and pulled out his notepad. At the top of a blank page, he wrote, K. Morrison, liability assessment. Then he circled her name. Once. Twice. 3 times in red ink, pressing hard enough that the pen left indentations on the page below. The machinery had been activated. The wheels were in motion now. And Sterling sat back in his chair, confident in the knowledge that he had built a network of obligation and leverage substantial enough to eliminate one nurse before she could eliminate him. What he didn't know was that Katie Morrison had spent 8 years as a senior chief petty officer running covert medical operations in Kandahar, that her hands had closed wounds on soldiers whose names she would never be allowed to speak, that she had walked away from classified missions and a life redacted by the government itself. And what he absolutely did not know was that one former combat medic on the recovery floor was already making a phone call of his own. The appendectomy was textbook. Katie stood across the surgical table from Dr. Sterling, instruments arranged in exact order on the Mayo stand, her movements economical and precise. The patient's abdomen lay open beneath the surgical lights, the inflamed appendix already mobilized and ready for ligation. Sterling worked with a surgeon's arrogance, fast, confident, dismissive of protocol. He reached for the suture without asking. Katie had it in his hand before his fingers closed. The attending surgeon, Dr. Patel, noticed. He watched Katie's hands move through the field, laying down sutures with attention and spacing that belonged in a trauma bay, not an elective procedure. Field technique. Downrange. The kind of precision you learned when you didn't have time for cosmetic closure, when the next explosion might come in 4 minutes and you needed that soldier alive regardless of scars. The suture she tied was a modified Ranger knot, not taught in civilian nursing schools. Not taught anywhere except to combat medics and field surgeons operating in Kandahar, in Fallujah, in forward operating bases where the electricity ran on generators and the antibiotics were rationed. Sterling didn't notice. He was already moving on to the next layer, talking about his golf handicap, complaining about the hospital's new credential verification system. Dr. Patel noticed. Everything. The patient being wheeled out of pre-op that morning had been Marcus Chen, 53, former Army combat medic with the 75th Ranger Regiment. A heart attack in the waiting room, his appendix inflamed for weeks undiagnosed. They'd stabilized him, and now he was post-surgical in recovery, oxygen at 2 liters, monitor beeping steady, the kind of board consistency that meant nobody was dying today. Katie checked his vitals at 2:15 p.m., her chart notation precise, BP 118/72, O2 sat 97%, heart rate 71 and regular. Normal. Healing. Marcus watched her hands as she adjusted his foredrip. His eyes had been tracking her since she'd scrubbed in during the appendectomy, watching from the observation gallery above the OR. 68-year-old eyes that had seen field hospitals in Kandahar, that had recognized the specific angle of her suture work, the modified Ranger knot, the spacing that predicted blood loss rather than appearance, the way she'd cleared the field without being asked because in a combat zone, your team moves like a flock of starlings, no words necessary. You learned that downrange, didn't you? His voice was rough, still foggy from anesthesia, but the words landed like bullets fired from muscle memory. Katie's hand froze for exactly 1 second. Long enough for her to calculate the risk. Long enough for her to understand that she'd made a mistake in the OR, that her body had remembered Kandahar more clearly than her mind had authorized. She resumed adjusting the four, her voice steady, volume low enough that the nurses at the station couldn't hear. I don't know what you mean, Mr. Chen. 75th Ranger Regiment. Kandahar, 2015 to 2017. You learned that not from a combat medic who knew you. He closed his eyes, his breathing already slowing from the anesthesia. Or you are one. She left the room without responding. But Marcus Chen, who had spent 32 years moving information between people who needed to know, already had his phone on the hospital bedside table. And he was already making a call that would echo backward through networks and databases and classified channels that most people at Mercy General didn't know existed. That same afternoon, Dr. Sterling sat in his office reviewing Katie's latest chart audits. She'd flagged 17 cases in the last 10 days. 17. Each flag corresponded to a surgical billing code that Sterling had inflated, claiming complexity and extended operative time that hadn't materialized. The cases totaled $472,000 in fraudulent billing codes submitted to insurance companies and Medicare. $472,000 that had appeared in Sterling's accounts in careful increments, never large enough to trigger scrutiny, distributed across 3 years and 8 different billing seasons. Katie's audits were meticulous. Obsessive. She cross-referenced operative reports against billing codes, compared Sterling's average surgical times against national benchmarks, flagged discrepancies smaller than most nurses would notice. A surgery billed as complex that appeared to last 40 minutes. A diagnostic procedure coded as major surgical intervention. An appendectomy that Sterling had marked as emergency when the patient's presentation showed classic chronic inflammation. She was going to destroy him. He picked up the phone and called Chairman Moss at 2:53 p.m. They didn't use names. They didn't need to. The new ER transfer. Katie Morrison. Sterling's voice was level, professional, the voice of a colleague making a casual observation. I'm concerned about her nursing school transcripts. There's a 3-year employment gap. No explanation. And her clinical presentation shows patterns of overreaction to routine patient presentations. I'm wondering if someone should do a credential verification. Moss understood. Moss had made $740,000 from Sterling's billing schemes over the past 3 years. Moss had a lake house in Tahoe that existed because of those dollars. Moss would make one phone call. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, the call had reached Medical Director Thomas Vance. By 3:15, Vance had Katie scheduled for an emergency performance review at 4 o'clock. The message in her email was casual, routine credentialing verification. Standard procedure for all staff beyond 90 days. Katie read it once. She read it twice. She did not read it a third time because she already understood that something had moved against her, that her 3 weeks of invisibility had ended, that Sterling had finally recognized her as a threat. She sat in the performance review meeting in Vance's office at exactly 4 o'clock. Vance's expression was carefully neutral, the expression of someone who had been asked to do a task by someone important, someone whose reasons weren't his business. He opened a folder that hadn't existed that morning. Your nursing school transcripts show a 3-year gap between sophomore year and junior year, Vance said. Your resume shows no employment during that period. Can you explain the gap? I can't discuss that period. It's classified. The words hung in the office like a body suspended in water. Vance's eyebrows rose exactly half an inch. His pen stopped moving across his notepad. Classified? For a nurse? His voice carried the specific tone of a man who had been told to ask these questions, and who was now receiving an answer that didn't match any of his expectations. That would be unusual. Yes, Katie said. Her hands were folded on her lap. Her voice was a blade drawn over ice. It would be. Vance closed the folder. He would report back to Moss. Moss would report back to Sterling. The pattern was clear. This woman was hiding something. This woman had secrets that couldn't be verified. This woman was exactly the kind of liability that hospitals paid consultants to remove. By tomorrow, 3 board members would have received personal emails citing concerns about credential verification and workplace stability. By next week, Katie Morrison would be unemployable in Houston. But that wasn't how the story moved forward. At 4:45 that afternoon, on the 4th floor of Mercy General, Robert Daniels lay in bed in room 4127. He was 7 feet tall, 190 pounds of muscle and rage, admitted 3 days ago after a motorcycle accident that should have killed him. His chest had impacted the highway barrier at 60 miles per hour. CT scan showed negative for pneumothorax, negative for major thoracic trauma. He was stable. Healing. Except he wasn't. Katie pulled his chart at 5 o'clock because her combat training didn't sleep and didn't clock out and didn't accept what the computer said when her body recognized the signature of a wound about to turn. She reviewed the imaging from day 1 of admission, CT chest at 2:15 p.m. on admit day. Lungs clear. No pneumothorax. No free fluid. But the vital sign trend was a story that the imaging couldn't tell. Day 1, oxygen saturation 99%. Day 2, 97%. Day 3, 94%. And this afternoon at 2 o'clock, 92% on room air. The jugular veins on his last assessment were distended. His breathing, according to the nurse's note from 3 o'clock, was slightly elevated. Slightly elevated. Like a tsunami, was slightly wet. A tension pneumothorax didn't always appear on initial imaging. It developed gradually, air leaking from the lung, accumulating in the pleural space, collapsing the lung, pushing against the heart, suffocating the patient from the inside. Katie flagged the chart for the attending physician at 5:15 p.m., her note clinical and specific, declining O2 sat trending since admit. Distended JVD. Suspect delayed tension pneumothorax from thoracic trauma. Recommend repeat imaging and clinical evaluation for needle decompression. Needle decompression. A 14-gauge angiocath needle inserted at the second intercostal space, midclavicular line. 30 seconds to save a life. She'd done it 4 times in Kandahar, and 4 times the soldiers had lived because she'd moved fast and trusted her instincts instead of waiting for imaging. Dr. Sterling found her note in the chart queue. He read it once. He read it twice. And then he picked up his phone and sent a department-wide email, copied to every attending and medical director at Mercy General. Please be advised that Nurse Katie Morrison has submitted multiple chart flags in the past 10 days citing concerns for emergency conditions that do not meet clinical criteria for escalation. As part of our quality improvement initiatives, we are reviewing patterns of potential overreaction to routine clinical presentations. If you receive similar flags from this nurse, I recommend reviewing for clinical merit before escalating patient care unnecessarily. The email was sent at 5:31 p.m. It was marked urgent. That evening, Katie sat alone in the break room with Robert Daniels' chart open on her lap. The fluorescent lights hummed above her like insects trapped in plastic. She read the imaging report again, page by page. She read the clinical notes. She read the vital sign trends, and what she read was a man dying by degrees while everyone around him looked at a 3-day-old CT scan and called him stable. She photographed the chart pages with her phone, a violation of HIPAA protocol, a violation of hospital policy, a violation of the careful rules she'd been following since the moment she'd stepped into Mercy General. But her hands were the hands of a senior chief petty officer in special forces, and those hands didn't follow civilian rules when lives were running out of time. She photographed 6 pages. Then she wrote a note directly to the night supervisor, her handwriting precise and urgent, recommend evaluation of room 4127 for tension pneumothorax. Declining SATS. Distended JVD. Clinical presentation matches 3 prior cases I observed downrange. This patient needs imaging and possible emergency decompression. She left the note on the night supervisor's desk at 7:42 p.m. Dr. Sterling found it at 8:15 p.m. and threw it away. Robert Daniels lay in room 4127 as night fell over Mercy General, his breathing becoming labored, his oxygen saturation dropping with each hour, his body accumulating the air that should have escaped weeks ago, and nobody heard the warning that Katie Morrison had tried to sound because the warning had been silenced by a man who needed her silence more than he needed his patient alive. The night was just beginning. The next afternoon, the OR schedule ran normal, routine appendectomy in operating room 3, surgical team in position, anesthesia dialed in, incision made at 2:22 p.m. Dr. Sterling stood at the scrub sink reviewing his phone. 3 calls placed. 2 board members already returning his voicemails. The investigator had updated him at lunch. Katie's military references were proving difficult to reach, or worse, were refusing to comment. Sterling smiled. Dead ends were better than denials. Dead ends looked like someone with something to hide. At 2:51 p.m., the ER intercom crackled. Code response requested. Psychiatric patient, 7th floor, acute behavioral crisis, patient currently non-responsive to verbal de-escalation. Katie was in trauma bay 2 applying sutures to a laceration when the ER attending flagged her. We're short-staffed. Can you assist with behavioral crisis? Patient's massive, possibly combative. She nodded. The attending briefed her en route. Robert Daniels, 43, admitted 72 hours ago with anxiety disorder and untreated asthma. Chart shows possible recent chest injury. He was evasive about it. Psych started him on antipsychotics yesterday, but his behavior's escalating. Agitation, confusion, difficulty breathing. He's in the isolation room. Katie's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Difficulty breathing. Agitation. Confusion. Those weren't psychiatric symptoms if the respiratory component came first. They reached room 4127. Robert Daniels sat rigid on the bed, his massive frame, 6'9", maybe 6'10", folded awkwardly against the mattress. His face was purple-tinted. His neck veins were severely distended, pressed outward like water balloons on the verge of rupturing. His breathing came in short, panic gasps through pursed lips, the distinctive breathing pattern of someone fighting against internal pressure. Katie saw it immediately. Tension pneumothorax. Untreated. Worsening. Robert, I'm Katie. I'm a nurse. Can you tell me how long you've been having trouble breathing? His eyes wheeled toward her, unfocused, wild. Can't breathe. Too much pressure. Something's wrong. Something's pushing inside. The attending was already reaching for a phone. I'll contact the ER physician and get cardiology. We don't have time. Katie's voice dropped. Flat. Command. Not a request. This is acute tension pneumothorax. He needs emergency decompression now. Where's the crash cart? Before the attending could respond, Robert Daniels lurched to his feet, his massive body suddenly kinetic with panic. He grabbed the metal for stand beside his bed, the heavy stainless steel kind with a hanging bag and multiple lines, and wrenched it free from its base. The saline bag tore. Fluid sprayed across the linoleum. He swung the stand like a man fighting an invisible attacker, his movements jagged and desperate. Get out! His voice shook the windows. Get out! Get out! Get out! The attending bolted. A nurse behind Katie screamed and ran for the side exit. 2 orderlies who'd been standing near the doorway didn't hesitate. They moved faster, toward the elevators, toward anywhere that wasn't this room. The crash cart sat 12 feet away, too far to reach in chaos. Robert Daniels spun the four-stand in a wide arc, connecting with the wall monitor. It exploded in sparks, then hung dead. Katie Morrison stood still. She didn't step back. Didn't flinch. Didn't raise her voice. Instead, she took one measured breath and did what she'd been trained to do in Kandahar when everything fell apart. She moved toward the threat, not away from it. Robert. Her voice was low, utterly level, carrying the kind of certainty that comes from command. From having made life-and-death decisions in compounds while incoming fire tore through walls. Look at me. Only at me. Robert's wild eyes found hers. The four-stand wavered in his grip. You can't breathe because there's air trapped in your chest cavity. Katie stepped forward slowly, her hands open and visible. Not because you're crazy. Not because you're bad. Because something physical is wrong and we can fix it. I can't. I know. She kept moving. Her peripheral vision tracked his jugular veins, the way they pulsed with internal pressure, the way his skin had taken on that desperate purple cast. She was 5 feet away. 4. I know exactly what's happening to your body, Robert. I've seen this before. In people much tougher than you, and they survived because someone knew what to do. Robert's breathing became a bit slower. Still panicked, still labored, but fractionally less desperate. I need you to lower the stand. Katie was at the crash cart now, her hands moving with precision toward the supplies. She pulled a 14-gauge angiocath needle, the kind used for emergency thoracic decompression. Her movements were calm. Inevitable. Like a surgeon who'd done this 1,000 times. You're not in trouble. I'm not mad. But right now your body needs help. Robert Daniels' grip on the 4-stand loosened. Just slightly. Katie turned to face him, the needle visible but not threatening. She held it at chest height so he could see. I'm going to touch your chest now, find the space between your ribs where the air is trapped, and I'm going to let that air out. You'll feel pressure first. Then relief. Then you'll be able to breathe again. She stepped closer. Robert was taller by a full foot, his mass overwhelming, his eyes still wild with that desperate confusion of hypoxia. But he didn't swing the 4-stand. He lowered it. Katie positioned herself at his left anterior chest, second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. She'd done this in field conditions, in moving vehicles, with rounds flying past. This was a quiet hospital room. This was perfect conditions. Her hands were steady as surgical steel. Second breath in, I'm going in. Robert nodded. He was breathing. Following her instructions. The confusion was clearing because his oxygen was the real problem, not his mind. Katie found the intercostal space, felt the membrane beneath his skin, and drove the needle in. For a single suspended moment, nothing. Then a hiss. Loud. Unmistakable. The sound of air escaping, pressure releasing, 7 hours of trapped pneumothorax venting into the atmosphere. The effect was immediate. Robert's face shifted. His eyes cleared. His shoulders dropped. He gasped in a deep breath, not panicked, not desperate, just oxygen finally reaching his lungs. Another breath. His skin color shifted from purple toward something approaching normal. The jutting veins in his neck deflated like balloons. He swayed. Katie caught him, guiding his massive frame down onto the bed gently, his breathing now clear and regular as his oxygen saturation climbed from the dangerous zone toward normal. Her hand stayed on his shoulders until she was certain he was stable, then she stepped back. You're going to be fine now, she said quietly. Just breathe. Just breathe. In that moment, the hallway outside operating room 3 was still erupting into chaos. The surgical team had abandoned the appendectomy mid-procedure and was streaming toward the exits in near panic. Someone was calling for security, someone was screaming about an armed patient. Dr. Sterling watched from the OR control room monitors, his eyes fixed on the security feed from room 4127. He saw it all. Saw Katie walk toward a 7-foot attacker that everyone else was running from. Saw her stand calm while a metal for stand was swung like a weapon. Saw her move toward the crash cart without panic, without hesitation. Saw her perform a procedure that belonged in an operating room with full anesthesia, alone in an isolation room with a violent psychiatric patient, and saw that patient collapse peacefully into her arms instead of swinging. He saw a man whose behavior she'd predicted before anyone else even noticed something was wrong. He saw a procedure performed with the kind of certainty that only comes from. Sterling's hands went white on the edge of the monitor. His jaw locked. She'd said that patient had a tension pneumothorax. 3 days ago. In her chart audit. Before the psychiatric team even admitted the patient. Before anyone recognized what was actually wrong. Because she'd seen something in the chest X-ray that indicated a pneumothorax that was slowly worsening, and she'd flagged it, and it had been buried in a psychiatric consult, and nobody listened, and now it had nearly killed him. And she'd just saved his life using a procedure that should have required an MD's authorization and probably would have killed her if it had gone wrong. She'd risked her career. Maybe her license. To save someone the system had already decided was just a behavioral problem. Sterling pulled out his phone. His hands were shaking, but not from admiration. He called board member Thomas Moss first. The nurse. The Morrison woman. We need to move faster. She just performed an unauthorized emergency procedure on a psychiatric patient. No physician authorization. That's grounds for immediate suspension. He paused, listening, then, no, she doesn't have it. I've verified, her credentials don't match up with what she claims. The investigator confirmed it this morning. He hung up and immediately dialed the second board member. Then a third. He reached the outside investigator next and updated her with urgent language. Escalate your timeline. The employee is becoming increasingly unstable. She's now conducting unauthorized emergency procedures without proper oversight. I'm documenting this for legal purposes. Then he called Katie's references again. The ones who'd been reluctant to comment. He was direct this time. I'm calling to inform you that Katie Morrison has exhibited serious instability in her behavior. She performed an unauthorized medical procedure today. She may reach out to you claiming there was some kind of miscommunication about her past employment. We need your official statement that her previous service history was questionable. The reference, a man whose name Katie had never actually mentioned to Sterling, said carefully, I'm not sure what you're referring to, Doctor. I don't have any concerns about her performance. Sterling's jaw tightened. Then you're confirming she worked in a capacity that involved classified materials. Silence. Then, I can't discuss that. Sterling hung up. Perfect. Classified. Buried records. An employee who couldn't defend herself without breaking some kind of military secrecy agreement. He was already composing the termination letter in his head. Katie Morrison was called to HR at 7:24 p.m., after her shift had ended, after she'd spent 3 hours with hospital security answering questions about the procedure she'd performed without authorization. Her hands were shaking, not from fear but from the adrenaline crash of having just talked someone down from a violent crisis. Hospital Administrator Patricia Vance was waiting with a folder that had been prepared with remarkable speed, considering the day had only started 6 hours ago. Ms. Morrison. Thank you for meeting with us. Vance's voice was professional but careful. We've conducted a preliminary review of your credentials and your employment history, and we've identified some serious discrepancies. Katie sat without being asked. Your nursing degree checks out. Your licensure is current. But your background employment, specifically your stated military service as a senior chief petty officer, we're unable to verify with any official military records. Vance slid a single sheet across the desk. Additionally, we've documented a serious breach of protocol today when you performed a thoracic decompression without physician authorization. Regardless of the outcome, this constitutes practicing medicine without a license. Katie read the termination letter. Clean language. Airtight. Citing credential irregularities and unauthorized treatment. I understand, Katie said quietly. Do you have any explanation for the discrepancies in your background? Katie looked at the folder. Thought about the orders she'd been given. About the classified mission that had gone sideways in Kandahar in 2016. About the Pentagon official who'd personally told her that her service was being erased, that her records were being sealed, that she needed to disappear into civilian life and never surface. I can't explain, Katie said. I'm sorry. She signed the termination letter with her full name, picked up the folder, and walked out of Mercy General Hospital without looking back. The parking lot was dark. Rain had started to fall, soft at first, then harder, drumming against the asphalt like distant gunfire. Katie sat in her car for 20 minutes with her hands on the steering wheel, unable to move. Her scrubs were still wet from Robert Daniels for fluid. Her muscles ached from the tension of the crisis. Her career was over because she couldn't defend herself. She drove home in silence. Katie sat at her kitchen table at 2 in the morning, still wearing her scrubs, the cotton clinging to her skin like a second illness. The termination letter lay flat on the table beside her untouched coffee, its letterhead crisp and official: misrepresentation of credentials, unauthorized treatment protocols, failure to maintain professional standards, effective immediately. Her hands didn't shake. That wasn't composure anymore, it was something closer to paralysis, a flat line of the nervous system. She had defended herself the only way she could. Told them her work was clean. Told them the patient in OR3 was coding and she responded. Told them the needle decompression was emergency protocol. But she couldn't tell them the truth. Couldn't say the military had ordered her to disappear, that her service records were classified, that the Pentagon had erased her existence from every official database on the planet. To prove who she was meant breaking an oath that had shaped her entire adult life. So she had said nothing. Dr. Sterling had called in favors from 3 board members whose offshore accounts he'd quietly enriched through inflated surgical billing codes. He'd contacted her sparse references, a civilian nursing program director, a staffing agency, with fabricated concerns about her stability, her judgment, her reliability. He'd brought in an outside investigator, a thin man in an ill-fitting suit who'd spent exactly 4 hours examining her charts and suddenly discovered credential discrepancies that didn't exist. The investigator's report landed on the administrator's desk that evening. Recommendation: immediate termination pending credential verification through the Texas Board of Nursing. Katie had been escorted out by hospital security at 6:33 p.m. No ceremony. No goodbye. Just a cardboard box containing her personal items and a plastic badge they'd swiped inactive before she reached the parking lot. Rain had started falling as she drove home, the kind of rain that comes in sheets, hammering the windshield like the sky itself was angry. She hadn't cried. Not in the car, not in the driveway, not while changing out of her scrubs and hanging them over the back of a chair to dry. She'd simply moved through the apartment with the mechanical efficiency of someone going through a pre-programmed sequence, each motion purposeful but empty of meaning. The kitchen light cast everything in a sallow, hospital pale yellow. That was when the silence had finally broken her. Her teenage son Nathan found her at 2:14 a.m., still in yesterday's t-shirt and yesterday's shock, tears streaming down her face without sound. He stood in the doorway for a moment, confused, afraid. He'd never seen his mother cry. In 17 years, he'd never once seen her break. "Mom." His voice cracked. "Why are you home? What happened?" Katie looked at him, this young man who'd grown up with half a mother, a woman who couldn't explain where she went on classified assignments, who couldn't talk about her scars, who spent his childhood learning that some love means learning to live with permanent absence. She reached for words and found none. "The hospital let me go." He sat down across from her, his lanky teenage frame folding into the chair like he was trying to make himself smaller. "Why?" "They said I misrepresented my credentials." "Did you?" "No." He believed her instantly. That was the worst part, he'd never questioned her, never needed evidence or explanation. He simply knew his mother was not a liar. And she was letting his world collapse because she couldn't tell him why. 3 days later, Nathan walked into the office of Hospital Administrator Michelle Chen on the 3rd floor of Mercy General carrying a showbox he'd found buried in the back of the garage, tucked behind winter coats they never used in Houston. His voice was steady, borrowed military precision. "My mom's senior chief petty officer Katie Morrison, and you need to see these." The administrator's hands trembled as she opened the box. The trembling wasn't weakness, it was the physical response to understanding that she'd just made a catastrophic mistake. Inside, laid carefully on dark blue velvet, were 3 medals, each on its own ribbon. Michelle Chen pulled the first one free. A ribbon of red and white and blue. She read the citation aloud, her voice barely a whisper at first, for meritorious service in combat operations. Her voice grew stronger as she read. Demonstrated exceptional courage, medical intervention, saved multiple lives under direct fire. A Bronze Star with Valor. She lifted the second medal. Silver ribbon with raised device. She read, for gallantry in action, Kandahar Province, direct engagement with hostile forces, extraordinary composure under combat conditions. A Silver Star. Then the third. Another silver ribbon, another raised device, another citation that made her voice crack. For gallantry in action, extraordinary bravery, selfless service. A second Silver Star. And one more. Purple silk ribbon with white edges. A Purple Heart. The door opened. A man in civilian clothes stood in the doorway, tall, shoulders built like someone who carried equipment for a living, face weathered by sun that only existed downrange. His eyes landed on the medals, and something shifted in his expression, recognition, respect, the kind of honor that only another operator could carry. Senior Chief Morrison earned those, he said quietly, each word a command. 2 silver stars, a Bronze Star with Valor, and a Purple Heart for operations I'm still not cleared to discuss. I served with her in Kandahar. She saved my life. Saved for other operators that same day. He paused, letting the weight settle. Her name doesn't exist in any official record because her work was classified. Still is. If you terminated her based on credential verification, you terminated a decorated combat veteran and called her a liar. The silence in the office was absolute. And then an FBI agent stepped forward from the hallway, her credentials already displayed. We've been investigating Dr. Sterling's insurance fraud for 6 months, she said, her voice carrying the precise control of someone who'd delivered bad news before. The hospital's IT director, a Marine Corps veteran named Daniel Reeves, preserved every frame of security footage Sterling attempted to delete this morning, including documentation of his coordination with that investigator to fabricate credential concerns. Reeves himself appeared, stocky and crew-cut, carrying a hard drive like it was evidence from a crime scene. He nodded to Nathan. Semper Fi, Senior Chief, he said, and the language itself was a flag planted on the truth. The outside investigator Sterling had hired was questioned by federal agents that same afternoon. He immediately provided evidence of 17 previous cases, 17 staff members he'd been paid to discredit, 17 careers he'd helped destroy. One was a respiratory therapist who'd questioned Sterling's ventilator settings. Another was a pharmacist who'd flagged suspicious medication patterns. Sterling's network was an infrastructure of corruption, and the investigator was its detailed blueprint. Dr. Sterling was arrested at 4:53 p.m. as he left the surgical lounge, federal agents entering Mercy General as if they owned the place. He was led out in handcuffs past a hallway crowded with staff, his head down, his $10,000 Rolex catching the fluorescent lights one final time. "This is absurd," he shouted, his composure shattering like tempered glass. "I'm a respected surgeon. I've done nothing wrong." The FBI agent's response was clinical, 17 months of inflated billing codes. $680,000 in fraudulent charges. Communication showing deliberate coordination to terminate a whistleblower. You're under arrest for healthcare fraud, wire fraud, witness tampering, and obstruction of justice. Within a week, Sterling's medical license was permanently revoked. His assets were frozen, the luxury condo in the Galleria district, the imported Mercedes, the investment accounts. The Medical Board of Texas launched an emergency hearing. His network collapsed like dominoes, board members lawyered up, the compliance investigator became a prosecution witness, 3 nurses came forward with stories of intimidation and coercion. Katie's fabricated disciplinary complaints were exposed as fiction. The incidents never occurred. The witnesses Sterling had cited denied ever speaking to him. Every document was a forgery. Every charge was smoke. 6 months later, a Mercy General janitor named Carlos was leaving the hospital at dusk when he spotted someone in the parking lot of a strip mall 2 blocks away. Dr. Sterling sat beneath a faded umbrella at a folding table, wearing a wrinkled shirt and a cheap tie, selling supplemental insurance policies to people passing by. His expensive suit was gone. His authority was gone. His identity had become exactly what he'd tried to make of Katie: our erasure, reconstruction, irrelevance. Katie Morrison returned to Mercy General as the hospital's new director of emergency medical services. Her office was on the 3rd floor. There was a window. The nameplate on her door was engraved in gold letters: Katie Morrison, Director of Emergency Medical Services. Beneath it, in smaller text, she had requested: "Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns." In her desk drawer, in the same showbox Nathan had carried to the administrator's office, Katie kept one item that no one else was allowed to touch. The faded unit patch her son had found sewn inside the lining of her old deployment jacket, tiny stitches worn soft by 17 years of service, a quiet reminder that some things stay hidden until the moment they're needed most. Marcus Chen, the combat medic who'd recognized her surgical technique, now worked as a physician assistant in her department. They never spoke about Kandahar. The understanding was there in the silence: two people who'd lived in the same war, who'd learned to save lives when everything was breaking. Robert Daniels, the psychiatric patient from OR3, had sent a letter 6 weeks into his recovery, the handwriting shaky but determined: "You saw me when I couldn't see myself. You didn't run. You never ran." Her son kept the photo from her Navy commendation ceremony on his desk at college. On Katie's first day as director, she walked through the cafeteria, the same one where Sterling had knocked her lunch tray to the floor, and the entire staff stood and applauded. Not politely. Not because they'd been told to. But because they understood, finally, who had been standing among them all along. Katie Morrison nodded once, her composure perfect, and continued to her meeting. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your real strength, you understand Katie's journey. Subscribe for more stories about the quiet warriors among us, the ones carrying invisible honors, the ones who walk toward the danger everyone else runs from. Like and comment with your own story of being misjudged. You're not alone.